This isn't just one church. This is happening in thousands of small towns across America right now. In 2025 alone, experts predict that 15,000 churches will close their doors permanently. Not 1,500, 15,000. That's more than 40 churches closing every single day. If I told you that 100,000 schools were going to close, people would be talking about it everywhere. But 100,000 churches. Most people don't even know it's happening. So today, we're diving deep into one of the most significant cultural shifts happening in America. A shift that's particularly devastating small-town communities. We're going to explore why these churches are emptying out, what it means for the towns themselves, and what happens to these beautiful buildings once the congregations are gone. Whether you're religious or not, this matters. Because when churches close in small towns, it's not just about religion. It's about the fabric of entire communities unraveling. The staggering numbers. According to the National Council of Churches, approximately 100,000 churches across the United States are expected to close in the coming years. That's about 1/4 of all churches currently in operation. Tom Rayner, a church health consultant, predicts that 15,000 churches will close in 2025 alone. That same year, another 15,000 churches will shift from full-time to part-time pastors, which is often the last step before closure. Here's the devastating reality. For every church that opens in America, about 3 churches close. Small towns and rural communities are being hit the hardest. Young people leave for college and jobs. The elderly who remain can no longer financially sustain the buildings. And unlike urban churches that might attract new members from growing neighborhoods, small-town churches have a shrinking pool of potential members. In rural Iowa, 8 churches closed in the small town of Ottumwa in recent years. In western New York, the Catholic Diocese announced the closure of approximately 100 parishes, about half of all churches in the area. The financial reality. Here's a number that explains a lot. It costs approximately $7 to $10 per square foot per year to operate a church building. So a modest 10,000 square foot church costs between $70,000 and $100,000 per year just to keep the lights on and the roof maintained. That doesn't include staff salaries, supplies, or programs, just the building itself. Now imagine you're a congregation of 30 people, most of them retired. Even if everyone tithed 10% of their income, which most don't, the math simply doesn't work. And that's before major repairs. Many church leaders confide that they're one new roof, one failed boiler, or one asbestos removal away from having to close. Researchers call it the great mismatch, small, aging congregations trying to maintain large, deteriorating buildings designed for much bigger groups. A church built in 1920, when the town had 5,000 residents, wasn't designed for a town of 1,200. Why young people aren't filling the pews. For the first time in American history, less than half of all Americans consider themselves members of a church, synagogue, or mosque. In 2000, that number was over 70%. By 2021, it had dropped below 50%. This decline is being driven almost entirely by young people. Among young adults, nearly 40% identify as religiously unaffiliated. It feels irrelevant. Ask young people who've left the church why, and one common answer is that church feels disconnected from their real lives. They're dealing with student loan debt, climate anxiety, economic uncertainty, mental health challenges, and questions about sexuality and identity. And when they go to church, these topics are either ignored entirely or addressed in ways that feel shallow or judgmental. One young person described it, "I was told church would help me navigate life's big questions. Instead, I got sermons about marriage and raising children. I'm 24, single, struggling to pay rent. Those sermons weren't for me." Hypocrisy and scandals. 32% of young adults who stopped attending cite judgmental or hypocritical church members as a reason. When you preach love on Sunday but gossip during the week, young people notice. When major scandals break, sexual abuse cover-ups, financial mismanagement, It reinforces the perception that religious institutions can't be trusted. The science question. 35% of young adults say Christians are too confident they know all the answers. 29% feel churches are out of step with the scientific world. For young adults pursuing STEM careers, a church that dismisses evolution or climate science feels intellectually stifling. Political and social issues. 25% cite disagreement with the church's stance on political or social issues as a reason for leaving. Young people see their LGBTQ+ friends being told they're sinful. They hear sermons about immigration, gender roles, or racial justice that clash with their own values. One young woman put it this way: I was taught Christians should care for the least of these, but when I tried to talk about refugee children at the border, I was told I was being too political. That's when I realized the church didn't actually care about the least of these, they cared about control. Practical barriers. 24% cite work responsibilities. They work retail with weekend shifts. They're juggling multiple gig economy jobs. They're exhausted from 60-hour work weeks. Sleeping in on Sunday feels more restorative than sitting through an uninspiring service. And in a small town with 3 churches, all traditional, all conservative, all aging, there's no alternative. It's those churches or nothing. Increasingly, young people are choosing nothing. The economic squeeze. Small towns across America are shrinking. Between 2010 and 2020, more than half of U.S. counties, most of them rural, lost population. The median age in rural America is now about 43, compared to 36 in urban areas. Churches depend on their members' financial contributions. When your congregation is mostly elderly people on fixed incomes, those contributions decline. Medical expenses increase. Meanwhile, the few young families who remain face student loans and childcare costs that limit what they can contribute. A congregation of 30 people might take in $50,000 to $80,000 per year. That might cover a part-time pastor and utilities, but leaves nothing for repairs or emergencies. The part-time pastor problem. Small churches increasingly can't afford full-time pastors. A full-time package might cost $60,000 to $90,000 per year, more than many congregations can afford. So churches shift to part-time or bivocational pastors. That limits availability for hospital visits, counseling, and community engagement. Tom Rainer predicts that 15,000 churches will move from full-time to part-time pastors in 2025 alone, often the first step toward closure. The vicious cycle. Fewer members means less money. Less money means fewer programs and declining maintenance. That makes it harder to attract new members. So membership continues to decline, leading to even less money, and the cycle continues until the church can't sustain itself. What happens when churches close? When a church closes in a small town, the ripple effects touch every aspect of community life. Loss of community space. Churches are often the primary, sometimes the only community gathering space. They host community dinners, support groups, food pantries, youth programs, and voting locations. Research shows that churches provide approximately $140,000 in annual community service value. Multiply that by 15,000 churches closing in a single year, and you're talking about billions in community services vanishing. Social safety net disappears. Churches run food pantries, provide emergency financial assistance, organize disaster relief, and offer free childcare. When the church closes, where do people turn? In many small towns, there are no other nonprofits. The nearest food bank might be 30 miles away. Symbolic loss. For many people, the church building is where they were baptized, married, and buried their parents. When that building closes, it feels like a piece of their history is being erased. In towns where churches are architectural landmarks, closure signals decline in a very public way. The loneliness epidemic. Churches have historically been one of the most important sources of social connection, especially for older adults. When churches close, many people lose their primary social community. They become more isolated, which has documented negative effects on mental and physical health. Creative solutions and repurposing. Not all church closures lead to abandoned buildings. Some incredibly creative solutions are emerging. Community hubs. Some churches are being repurposed into vibrant community centers. St. Peter's United Church of Christ in Louisville had dwindled to a dozen elderly members and a literally falling apart building. Now it's the Village at West Jefferson, a thriving development with affordable housing and community programs. Research shows that repurposed churches hosting multiple community functions see 300% more daily foot traffic than during their final years as worship-only spaces. Affordable housing. Converting old churches into housing has become popular. Churches often have high ceilings, large windows, and open floor plans that translate beautifully into living spaces. Converting an existing building costs about 40% less than building from scratch. First United Methodist Church in Atlanta is building more than 300 apartments on its land. Most will be affordable housing. The revenue will sustain the church's mission. Replanting. Some closed churches are brought back to life. In Russell, Kansas, First Southern Baptist Church closed in 2020. A young pastor saw an opportunity. After 15 months of renovation, Crosspoint Russell opened in September 2023. The pastor hoped 15 people might show up. Instead, 70 attended that first week. These stories are encouraging, but require significant investment that not every closed church can attract. Multiple use strategies. Some struggling churches aren't waiting to close. They're renting space to preschools, hosting farmers markets, allowing nonprofits to use meeting rooms, creating co-working spaces, even converting portions of property for solar farming or paid parking. The key is viewing the building not as a sacred shrine, but as a community asset that should work for the public good 7 days a week. The megachurch phenomenon. While small-town churches die, another phenomenon is happening: the rise of megachurches. Megachurches, Protestant churches with 2,000 plus weekly attendance, have exploded in growth. They offer professional music, state-of-the-art facilities, engaging preaching, and robust children's programs in growing suburban areas. They feel modern. The worship is contemporary. The preaching is practical. The facilities are impressive: coffee shops, bookstores, fitness centers. They offer anonymity and specialized programs for every demographic. But megachurches have problems. Their success is often built around charismatic leaders. When scandal hits, the church can collapse. They lack the intimate community smaller churches offer. And they're almost exclusively suburban. They don't solve small-town decline. In fact, they contribute to it by drawing people away. A small-town church with 30 members and a part-time pastor simply can't compete with a megachurch 30 minutes away that offers professional everything. Families with children especially are drawn to robust youth programs. What does the future hold? Let's be clear. The trend is not reversing soon. Demographic shifts, economic pressures, and cultural changes all work against small-town churches. Experts predict closures will continue at high rates for at least the next decade. Traditional denominations are developing strategic plans for which churches to close and how to help remaining congregations merge or share resources. The most successful approaches involve early intervention when churches show warning signs and helping churches explore creative uses before closure becomes inevitable. The community challenge. Local governments can no longer ignore this. When churches close at scale, it becomes an urban planning challenge. Communities need to think creatively about what happens to these buildings and how to maintain social connection. Churches have served as third places, neutral gathering spots where community happens. We desperately need more of these spaces, not fewer. Church evolution. For churches themselves, survival means evolution. The model that worked in 1950 no longer exists. Churches that are thriving share certain characteristics. They're flexible in how they use their space. They focus on authentic relationships rather than programs. They tackle difficult questions honestly. They're engaged beyond Sunday services. They're less concerned with tradition and more focused on mission. They measure success by impact, not attendance numbers. Hope in crisis. Here's what gives me hope. Crises create opportunities. Yes, closures are painful, but this is forcing us to reimagine what faith communities could be. Maybe the church of the future is smaller, more intimate, more focused. Maybe it meets in homes or coffee shops. Maybe it's less concerned with institutional survival and more focused on actually serving people. And for the buildings themselves, many are becoming more useful as repurposed spaces than they ever were as churches. A building that served 30 people 1 hour a week is now serving 300 people 7 days a week as affordable housing or a community center. That's not failure. That's transformation. The emptying of small-town churches is one of the most significant cultural and demographic shifts happening in America today. It reflects broader changes, population movement, economic transformation, evolving beliefs, and challenges facing rural America. For some, this is tragedy. For others, natural evolution. But regardless of how you feel about religion, we should all care about what happens when these community anchors disappear. The social connections, support systems, and gathering spaces churches provided were valuable, even essential, to community health. As we move forward, the question isn't whether small-town churches will close, they will. The question is, what will we do with the buildings they leave behind? How will we maintain community in their absence? And can we learn from this crisis to build something better? Those are questions worth asking. And they're questions that affect all of us, whether we've ever set foot in a church or not. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive.